listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. I am joined today by Valerie Reimer. She is the VP of Ad Tech and Product Partnerships at Acast. Valerie, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Heather. I'm excited to be here.
So I always just like to get a quick peek into your history, into the podcast space. I know you and I had the pleasure of being on a panel together here most recently at Podcast Movement, but what got you into the podcast space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in media and publishing for, about 15 years now. But, I'm about 6 months in here at Acast, but not my first podcast rodeo. I was over at iHeartRadio for about 7 years. And initially, when I first started, podcasting was it was 2017. We were just starting to get our feet wet into it. We definitely they had some really great things, but at the same time, it was like just ripe for growth. Like we were so ready to get into that space. And I kind of looked at it and I was like, I like radio, I like digital streaming, but I really like podcasting. And so my journey over at iHeart over the 7 years I was there, I increasingly got closer and closer into the podcasting space. And it just became such a major part of the business. When I was leaving iHeart, I really wanted to figure out where was next. And podcasting to me truly felt like the most important and impactful type of medium that I could end up being in. So I was very happy to end up being able to come over and join the Acast team earlier this year and in the role that I'm in now today. When you talk about podcasting and you start looking at it as an industry, you're starting to see a lot of really smart people from other parts of our industry all migrating into it. Because I think you're in a place where the business itself is getting more mature, but at the same time, there's so much room for growth. And just because of those two things, it's just become this really exciting medium for people to get involved in.
Right. I think you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, I feel like it was maybe just a little too green and too new, a few years back where people were like, oh, I don't know what they're doing over there in the podcast space. But it feels like we are definitely much more established as an industry. But I think what's so cool about it is that you can have such an impact on what is actually happening in the space. And I just think that to me seems like it's what's attracting great talent. And what I love and want to see more of is people who have been invested heavily in other mediums coming into the podcast space, because I think they've got a lot of knowledge and a lot of opportunity for us to take some of the learning that has happened in other arenas and apply them to podcasting, which it feels like that's kind of a lot of what you're doing here, is putting all of your knowledge toward the podcast space.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Business Insider I was at before iHeartRadio, so I did a lot of work when it came to print and digital print, and then evolved into video there, and then everything from cross-platform video and social at iHeart. All of that knowledge is now something that I try to apply on a day-to-day basis here to come up with new and unique solutions, either through partnerships or things that we build. We have an incredible product team that is always eager to trying to find solutions for any random problem I come to them or idea I come to them. They'll come back with 5 or 6 different solutions for us to kind of start vetting. So
yeah, I love that. So I wanted to ask a bit about brand safety, because I know that brand safety has been a really important initiative for your team at Acast. And I'm curious, kind of given the experience that you have had in other industries, how would you say that brand safety differs in the podcast space?
Yeah. So what's really interesting about podcasting in general is we have really low, invalid traffic and fraud risk. So when we're then talking about safety, it's actually, you're almost talking more about suitability, because the safety that you are concerned elsewhere, in other mediums, you just don't have it the way you have it here because of that direct nature of our deliveries, because of the low risk of bot traffics and impressions. Advertisers really benefit from high listener engagement, ensuring that ads are actually consumed by real audiences. Those aren't the concerns around safety in podcasting. The concerns around safety in podcasting is more around is this content suitable for my brand? And finding the right match of content for you. And I think that that's one thing that is very different between some of your other traditional social or, display or video. You still do have a lot of like invalid traffic issues and things like that where you just don't see that here.
I am so intrigued by that. I love to hear that. I would say that at True Native, we are very, very cognizant of just the numbers that come off of our shows. And if we see that they have a really small, unique listener group, but they have a huge download number, we're like, hey, something's off here. This all doesn't add up. You can't have 1,000 unique listeners and 1 million downloads a month. Like something is wrong. So we really try to be very cognizant of that. And I do think that potentially that's on the rise, but it's really interesting for me to hear you say that it's not as big an issue here in podcasting. So why do you think that is? Is it that maybe the energy just isn't being put toward that? What are your thoughts?
Could be the energy. Also, I think it's interesting because we've had learnings from other parts of the industry, IAS has their brand suitability or safety stamp that they do where you have to have less than 10% traffic of being invalid to be able to be approved as saying that you're IAS certified for brand safety for your delivery of your ads. I think that we've looked at it like it just either it hasn't caught up yet or it just isn't a
Hmm.
thing in my
Hmm.
mind.
Hmm.
But right now, it's something we can take advantage of in that regard. So we too are always very, very cautious and monitoring over here to make sure that we have very low IVT rates. And it's something that you're right. I think that it's something to watch out for. Like we
Hmm.
might see a rise of it, but we have not seen it yet.
Hmm.
So
Hmm. That's great. And we certainly do not want to speak it into existence. So
no, no, no.
I'm glad that we are not seeing more of that. It does feel like brand safety is becoming more of kind of a critical concern in the industry. And I love that you talk about kind of the difference between brand safety and brand suitability. But why do you think that it is becoming maybe more of a concern in the podcast space than we've seen in the past?
It's always been a concern, to be honest. I,
True.
I think that it's the growth of the medium. I think I read the other day that now podcasts are reaching over half of all US adults, and you have billions of downloads annually. That type of rapid growth always makes like a concern for advertisers.
Mhm.
It also creates a lot of opportunities. And I think that there's probably been a misalignment in like the understanding of what we can do from a safety standpoint in podcasting. And now all of the tools have caught up, like
Mhm.
the barometers of the world, the ComScore solutions, the sounders of the world, the IASs of the world. We now have these really advanced tools that can allow advertisers to find the right suitable content, to be able to put and analyze and target and report effectively and create those safe solutions that they can feel a little bit better about. So I don't necessarily think that it is now a concern. I think it's always been one.
Mhm.
I think it was the Journal of Advertising research stated that like more than 80% of marketing professionals believe that brand safety is a major concern within their buys. And that is not particular just to podcasting, that's just in general. So like
Mhm.
the concern around what is safe for a brand to run against has, I think, always been there. We just now have the tools to make it a little bit easier for us to analyze in the podcasting space.
Yeah. I think also I always just go back to like the traditional advertising days when it was really easy to see where you were advertising and you knew the content that your messaging was going to be next to. But if you're looking to scale any sort of obviously social, digital, and podcast buying, you're going to be along content that you haven't personally vetted, right? I mean, there is no way to scale a buy and still have that knowledge base. And so being able to use tools, I think, is really very, very important, especially anytime we have a host saying, hey, I use this product, I like this product. You really, at the end of the day, are being very much identified with that host and that audience as a brand. And if that's not who you're looking to identify with, that could be a real issue.
Oh, absolutely. I think you're right. If you really look back and you're like, okay, well, I used to buy the New York Times on this page next to this article, and you know exactly who is looking at it and you know exactly what you're being associated with. I think that the tools that have now evolved, Barometer, for example, which we use over here, we can do those checks using AI, making sure that whatever a brand deems is suitable actually is where they are aligning with, if that
Hmm.
makes sense. So like,
Hmm.
I want to get as granular as saying it's not only from a blocking standpoint, it's also from a targeting standpoint. So
Hmm.
about sports, and you could say, I want to run against sports content, but I don't want to run against violent sports content. So MMA, boxing, things like that. Some
Mm.
people might not deem that's violent, some people may. What's
Hmm.
suitable for your brand is what you get to decide. So you get to
Hmm.
say, great, so now not only running against the content genre sports, I'm also running against a whole bunch of other podcasts that have episodes around sports content, but I'm still being able to block out and say no boxing, no MMA, no jujitsu, any of the sports that your brand deems unsafe that you don't want to run against. And I think that's what gets really interesting because you can start going from the human vetting of maybe 50, 75 shows to saying, great, I'll run against 1,000 shows. I'll
Hmm.
run against 2,000 shows. And that type of scale and impact is just something that a lot of advertisers never historically felt comfortable with, but these tools are allowing them to do so.
Right. Well, and to your point, I think the real power is we've got the brand safety piece, we've got the brand suitability, but now we have the contextual targeting, which really is beautiful. And what I like about it so much, and you mentioned this, you could pick a podcast, right? We talked so much on this show about matchy advertising, right? Where it's like, hey, we're a supplement, we have to advertise on a health podcast, and that's what people want. But then you're really limiting the number of podcasts that you can advertise on. Instead, you could say, hey, we want to contextually target. Now we're going to run ads on shows that have an episode about healthy living, right? Instead of the
Right.
entire show is about healthy living. How are you seeing that kind of contextual targeting developing into success for advertisers?
Scale. I mean, that's exactly what you're saying. Like you're saying you used to only have 15 shows within your spec, but guess what? We just had 50 different cooking shows that had healthy recipes for Thanksgiving around it. And you want to align with those too. Like, I think that the contextual element allows you to get incredibly granular into shows that you wouldn't necessarily be associated with. And you get to have that scale. You get to be able to reach new listeners. Like
Hmm.
you might not have reached that listener because they weren't listening to a health food podcast, but they're health conscious and they're listening over here. And it then starts opening up who you're being able to reach for your own target markets too. I think that it's really important, when a brand comes to you and they're like, this is the one person I want to reach. You're like,
Hmm.
"Yeah, that's only one person.
Hmm.
Like and they're already buying you per se. So like,
Hmm.
how do we find the people that are like that one person that would be more susceptible to also buy you as a vitamin brand or a supplement of some sort? And I think that's where it's like we have to work with our advertisers and our partners for them to understand that even though you think you want this, you actually might want all of this. And contextual and being able to branch past kind of that one singular genre, but doing it safely and then doing it with targeting is something that I think is working really well,
Hmm.
and we are seeing growth in our partnerships, growth in the diversification of where brands are running, and ultimately it makes for a better user experience because you're not diluting specific markets too much.
Right, right. No, I think that you really hit the nail on the head because what I think brands need to really focus on is not either who is purchasing their product or maybe even who's buying a similar product, but who is that tipping point person, right? Like, where's that level of fringe consumers where they haven't bought this thing yet, but they're really close to, right? Because
Yep.
if you have somebody who is using a competitor, that's a different type of marketing tactic, right? Like getting someone to stop using your competitor and start using you is a much more difficult action to take. So, how could we help someone identify that audience that is someone who could potentially be in the market for your product if you told them how great it was? And that to me, when I think about marketing, is the sweet sauce of really creating great results. And that's what we're saying we can do with podcasting, which is pretty exciting.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think it's just a conversation that publishers and platforms we need to have with our brands and agencies to make
Mhm.
sure that they know that this is the capability that you can reach within this medium.
Well, and I think that what gets tricky in podcasting is that there are so many different ways to go about buying podcasts. And I think sometimes that can feel overwhelming to brands or maybe agencies that haven't purchased podcast advertising before. But I do really think that a good entry point into podcast advertising is buying in this way, where you're using tools to make sure that the content is suitable, you're making sure that it's safe, you're making sure you're targeting who you want to. And then as you're seeing results from that, then you can dial down and do a more refined campaign that's running on specific shows where maybe you decide to partner with this particular host in a deeper way. But being able to, as we've mentioned, scale at this level will create the results you're looking for, but it also gives you all of the learning and information you need to dial down and create something that's more integrated.
Absolutely. I think you always have to have a media mix when you're
Hmm.
approaching this. So
Hmm.
if you start doing things like, all right, I'm going to do a broad-based buy, I'm going to do attribution measurement on it, and then I'm going to take a look at the results and I'm going to see the top 10 shows that performed for me. Great. I'm still going to do that broad-based buy, but I'm going to reallocate some of that budget to do 10 show reads with these specific hosts to go more granular into their audiences. And then you can do that amplification. Something we've also seen work really well is maybe you're only picking one host and you're like, I want this host to endorse my brand. I want them to become almost a part of my brand. And then not only do I want to run it in their show, I want to run it across the network of shows. So
Hmm.
using that host's voice to be amplified in a bigger way, because then you still have that affiliation with like, this host is the person that I trust, but
Hmm.
you're hearing it within other shows that are like-minded listeners, like-minded content, and it allows then for a real good like affiliation for that brand with that host.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that concept. I think that's so, so smart. I'm
Yeah.
curious, getting back a bit to brand safety, are there certain genres that brands should be more cautious of? Like when I think about genres that maybe not always pass the sniff test, we're talking about things like kids content, right? Like think that there's a lot of brands that are worried about advertising into kids shows, or maybe true crime, or perhaps news. What do you see on your end when we're thinking about how to use those brand safety tools to, I guess, access the power of those audiences?
Yeah. I think, there's a couple different ways you can approach it. If you're doing like a broad-based buy and you want to be, here's all my different safety terms for suitability, and here's where I want to be, you should still make genre-based exceptions. So,
Hmm.
for example, you might want to be really strict against death and injury, but then you have to realize I'm probably going to be losing almost all of the content out of true crime. I'm going to be losing an enormous amount of inventory out of history. Like these are inherent topics that are true, but we kind of just have a bloody history. So I think you just have to be aware that if you want to layer on those tools, there are certain genres that aren't going to perform that well within those kind of like constraints or blocks that you would put on there. So either make exceptions or decide that that's not part of your strategy to associate with that type of content, which we don't recommend because it's great content and it's great listeners.
Hmm.
And just because the true crime podcast was talking about a murder doesn't mean that it's necessarily violent per se. Like, I think we
Right.
just have to be a little bit more comfortable in looking at that. I think kids' content, I think podcasting for kids content is incredible. Don't get me wrong. I do think it's hard for advertisers to be able to engage in an appropriate and contextually relevant and good way. I think COPA compliance is something you always really need to make sure that you're following when you're talking about that. And then I think it's just making sure that you are thinking outside of the box in how you are engaging.
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of educational based content, a lot of like bedtime story content for kids. That's really cool. And it's a great medium because you don't have screens. Like it
Mm.
is a really good medium for parents to use for education for their children to spark imagination. It's hard for advertisers to be able to engage in it in a meaningful way, though. I think, Disney's done some really interesting things in a good way, being able to use character voices and themed kind of moments within things. I think the partnerships with the Toonies boxes and the
Mhm.
podcasts that are on there, like,
Mhm.
again, those are more like deeper ingrained sponsorships, branded content per se, like deep integrations work, I think, a lot better when you're trying to like advertise to children in that way, because it's a little bit safer and makes a little bit more sense. And I think you can very quickly lose parents' trust if you advertise in an inappropriate way. And then at that point, it's going to be hard to come back from. So I would caution brands when they think about advertising to children.
Mhm. Well, and while I think that we should be using these tools to scale, I do think that creative is really important. So
Yeah.
you can't just create one ad and say, hey, I'm going to buy 10 million impressions across these 20 different genres, and we're just going to run this one ad, right? I'm not saying that if you're going to run across 20 different genres, that you need 20 different creative ads put together, right? Like you could
But why not?
definitely, but it's true, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're going to be advertising on a kids show, that ad should be very different than if you're advertising on a history show, right? Now, that might be a stretch to say that there's a product that's looking to target both of those audiences, but you never know. And it is really important to make sure that message is hitting your target despite using the capabilities of doing mass targeting, right?
Absolutely. I think it's also on the advertiser to make sure that the content that they're running as their ads is relevant and
Mhm.
culturally sensitive too. I think it's
Yeah.
really important to make sure that their ad is aligning with what they're advertising in. That's where you see some dynamic ad creatives. Technology is kind of really cool and interesting, like a million ads where you actually don't need to traffic 20 different versions of the ad. You actually can have it then personalized and customized based off of the triggers that we have. So,
Mhm.
okay, I know that this one is a sports podcast. I know it's delivering to someone on the East Coast and it's in the morning. All right, let me make sure that this is the creative that is delivered to that person. Oh, this person is listening to a true crime podcast and it's in the evening and they're in Florida and it's raining. Okay, let me deliver this creative. And that's another thing that our technology has now advanced, that we can do that in
Mhm.
podcasting. We can get really, really creative with the creative itself of the
Yeah.
ads. So I think
Yeah.
it's using AI too, which I think
Well,
that's
right.
like, that is one of the things I'm so excited about, of like excited and scared, but like excited about how AI is impacting both the
Mhm.
content side of it, the delivery side of it,
Mhm.
the creation of ads. Really fascinating space right now.
Yeah. We had Oscar on from Wondercraft not too long ago here, just a few weeks ago, really. And it's so fascinating to me to be able to use AI to help us with different ad iterations, right? Because number one, it's difficult, right, to come up with some creative concepts for all of the different targets that we're looking for, but it's also speed of execution, right? So I really believe that AI is going to help us execute more quickly, which means that we can test more, which means we can iterate better, which means that we can get better results, right? I mean, all of it just plays into itself. And it is freaky too. So you listen to those, don't ever listen to Diary of a CEO, man. Half of his guests are about how the world is ending in 4 years as soon as AI takes over. But for the time being, it's a great tool.
Yeah, it's scary, but it's good.
Well, and I think I try to remind myself, and I always feel like this makes me sound so incredibly old, but when I started in my career, the internet was a very new thing. And I always think like how many businesses I talked to who were like, I don't need to be involved with the internet really in any way. And now here we are,
Right.
several years later, but still, I mean, obviously technology has had such a massive impact. And I really do think that AI is going to be that. It's going to change the way that we're doing life and business. The scary part is we just don't know exactly how because it's kind of
Right.
unknown. But for the time being.
Yeah, that and like putting the AI in robots, like that's the part that really scares me. I can deal with it when it's on my computer, like, but the moment you put legs in AI, I don't know. We're
I
like
know, I know.
in a whole new world.
We don't want to do that. We don't want to. So I am curious what your thoughts are about kind of brand safety in particular. What do you see on the horizon? And we haven't talked about this at all, but obviously, like GARM was disbanded. Oh, I don't know. It's probably been 4 or 5 months ago now. And so I feel like that was kind of a shakeup moment a little bit, but we've got other governing bodies that seem like they're playing the same role. So it was kind of a hiccup. But like, where do you think we stand just with brand safety in general and where are we headed?
Yeah. I think GARM was a framework that still to this day is great. Like, to be
Mhm.
honest, even though they're disbanded, like the rules that they set up, I think are really beneficial for us to still look at. I
Mhm.
also think that that was just a baseline, though. I mean,
Right.
the conversations that we're having with brands often evolve past that. With the election that just happened, there was a lot of concern in making sure that we could put additional brand safety around not running against political content and things like that. And like, that's when we start talking again about suitability versus safety. And I
Mhm.
think trying to bucket something into like 16 or 12 categories, the dirty dozen that the IAB states, like those are again really good baseline jump off points for people who are maybe just starting to think about how to like look at brand suitability or safety. But I think it's going to evolve past that, and it's going to evolve very much into what works for this brand. Like, what categories do you want to add to that? What do you want to block? What do you want to target against? I think it's really interesting. Like, for example, like a bank, like if you said like Goldman Sachs, okay, I'm okay running against things that talk about all banking, but if the podcast mentions Goldman Sachs, I don't want to be in it. Like, those
Mhm.
are the things that get really interesting and again are very customizable to the brands themselves. So I don't think brand safety and suitability is going anywhere except for expanding. I think
Right.
that we'll look to have bigger and better tools both internally and also programmatically. I think we'll start to see the evolution of some of these tools into DSPs themselves. I think that it will end up putting controls into buyers' hands for them to be able to really customize, which I also think is going to be a benefit in a way where like they'll be able to start seeing how much their inventory shrinks. Like I think there's an inherent risk of the more safety you apply, the tinier the pools of inventory if you get too stringent, and trying to explain that to them can sometimes be challenging, but like if they get their hands on keyboards and they get to see, oh wow, I started with a universe of 100 million impressions and now I'm down to 100,000 impressions, let me start opening some of these things up. I think that can only benefit all of us. I don't know. I think you had the ones like Barometer, Sounder, Seeker, Sonnet. You had all of these ones that were really specific just to podcasting. But now I do see the IASs with their partnership with Spotify. You're seeing, DV starting to explore things. You're starting to see some of those ones that are bigger and more cross medium being
Mhm.
able to enter into the space because I think they're realizing that there's the maturity and the need for it. So it's going to be interesting to see how other larger cross-platform safety solutions want to approach if they're gonna build their own, if they're gonna acquire some of the companies that
Mhm.
are still out there independently. I think there's a lot of room for growth in it still.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, the more the industry grows, the more technology grows. These things just go hand in hand. And really, ultimately, it comes down to this idea of transparency. A brand wants to be able to create a campaign, know where they're advertising, know that they have confidence in what their tactics are, but then also know that they have the ability to really capitalize on what's out there. And these tools really help to do that. So
Yeah,
it's really valuable.
absolutely.
Thank you so much for being on the show today. I appreciate it. It's great to talk with you. You've got so much insight. If people are interested in connecting with ACAST to put together a campaign, where should they go?
Yeah, they can email sales@acast.com.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. That sounds great. Well, thank you for being on the show today.
Oh, Heather, thank you so much for having me. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope that you have enjoyed it. Brand safety is just a topic that we cannot get enough of because it is such an important piece of putting together campaigns. Please do go and subscribe to the show so that you are alerted when we have new episodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next. Thank you for listening to the Podcast to Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast to advertising industry.